I'm going to talk about the issues, and then I'm going to talk about the different political parties and how they responded to the issues. Okay. The first thing I want to talk about is patronage. Patronage is political favors in return for political support. Generally speaking, in the American system, political favors are jobs, and political support is votes, right? So essentially, what you're doing is you're exchanging votes for jobs, right? And one place where we can see that, I don't know how much of this you guys remember, but if you go back to 2008, when in the Democratic primary, we had Obama and Hillary Clinton running against each other. And it became evident that Obama was going to win. And so Hillary Clinton made a deal with Obama. And the deal that she made was that she would endorse him and encourage her supporters to support him in return for her becoming Secretary of State. You see what happens? So that's patronage. Patronage happens when you trade your support for a job. Okay. And that's something that happens in American politics. It used to happen at every level, right? It started really at the other level, at the other end, where you had groups of new voters who are organized into voting blocks. And I'm going to demonstrate that by asking you about Bugs Bunny. How many of you guys have seen Bugs Bunny cartoons? Does anybody notice that in Bugs Bunny cartoons, the cops, if there's a cop in the cartoon, they always have a certain accent? What is that accent? Now I want you to watch this.
Take the boys and surround the house! Jeez, fellas, the cops! Open up! This is the police! All right, Rabbit, where's Rocky? Where's he hiding? He's not in this stove. Oh-ho! He's hiding in the stove, eh?
Would I turn on the gas if he was in there?
You might, Rabbit, you might.
Well, would I throw a lighted match in there if he was in there?
Oh, no, you don't! Take me with you. Don't leave me with that screwy rabbit. Oh, I confess. I did it. Arrest me.
So, you guys get it? So why do you think that the cops in Bugs Bunny cartoons have Irish accents? See, you thought this class was going to be a waste of time. But I'm going to tell you why. And the reason why was because there was immigration to the United States. And when immigrants came to the United States, like, for example, if you were an Irish immigrant, you would go to an American city like Boston or New York or someplace like that. And there'd be sections of the city that were kind of divided off by country of origin. So there'd be an Irish section, and there'd be an Italian section, there'd be a Jewish section, that sort of thing, right? And if you were Irish, you came to America and you came to a city and you're in the Irish section of the city and you're looking for a job, where you're going to find a job is you're going to go down to the hiring hall. There's a place called the hiring hall, and there's a guy that runs the hiring hall, and we call him the boss. It's not Bowser from Super Mario Brothers. It's actually a machine boss or a political boss. And this political boss controls government jobs, right? So the reason why he's able to control the government jobs is because he's able to organize the voters in his district to vote for whoever is police commissioner. So basically what happens then is you go down to the boss at the hiring hall and you say, okay, I want a job. He says, okay, you can be a cop, because the Irish job was cops, right? So you can be a cop. And for 364 days a year, you would be a policeman. But on election day, your job was to make sure that everybody got out and voted early and often, to make sure your guy stayed in office. because if your guy stayed in office, then you could keep your job. So you job is a government favor in return for uh, political favor in return for the political support, which is the votes. All right. And really the way that it happens is that the boss is able to deliver the votes. So he gets to be the one who gives out the jobs. So now that's going to be a good system if you want people to be loyal to who's ever in office, because whoever is in office is the one who gives you your job, right? But there's going to be a downside to it too. What do you think that is? If you want to make sure that you stay the boss, how are you going to do that? Well, one way
Do
is
you,
to organize the vote, right? So like, you could say with 147% of the vote counted, we have a winner, right? The other way would be to maybe grease the skids for the guy who's in office, right? What would we call that? Bribery. Okay. So that means that American politics is inherently corrupt. American politics is inherently corrupt because it's driven by influence and money rather than, the free democratic spirit that was envisioned by the founders. You guys get what I'm saying here, right? Okay, so the question then about patronage is going to be, should we keep it and keep our government corrupt, or should we get rid of it? And if we did get rid of it, then how would we give out government jobs? And the answer is going to be by civil service reform, essentially going from the patronage system where you give out jobs for support like Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, or in the cities, rather than having whoever shows up at the hiring hall and delivering the votes getting the job. It's somebody who's actually been trained to be the policeman, right? And then when the government changes, you don't get a whole new set of policemen, right? So you get government stability. So the question then is going to be between this corruption that's represented in patronage, and it's on every level of American government, or are we going to have civil service reform? All right. Okay, the next one, money. The United States, for the era going into the Civil War, was had its economy based on the gold standard. The reason why was because the British were on the gold standard, and the Americans wanted to be in competition with the British. So if they were going to compete with Britain, they had to be on the same standard, and so they adopted the gold standard. And what the gold standard means is that for every dollar in circulation, there is a dollar's worth of gold in the treasury. Okay, so the dollar is actually a representation of specie. The word they call it is specie, right? So $1 bill is worth $1 worth of specie, and the specie is gold. All right. So $1 bill is equal to $1 worth of gold. All right. Now, during the Civil War, what happens is that the United States goes off the gold standard. And the reason why is because they needed more money to buy uniforms and things like that. So they wanted more money in circulation. And by putting more money in circulation, they were able to do all the things that they said they were going to do. The problem is that as you put more and more money into circulation, but you have the same amount of specie, what happens to the money?
decreases in value.
It decreases in value. And we call that what? Inflation,
Inflation.
right? Inflation, exactly, right? So now I'm going to give you some numbers here just to imagine. It's not the real number, right? But let's say that during this, we do see inflation, right? And let's say that during the Civil War, at the beginning of the Civil War, $1 was worth $1 in specie, right? But by the end of the Civil War, $1 was only worth 10 cents in specie. Or the other way around, that it took $10 to represent $1 worth of specie. You guys get what I'm saying? Okay. Now, after the Civil War, a lot of people wanted to go directly back to the gold standard. And the reason why was because they wanted, again, to be able to compete with the British. Okay. The problem was that if you went, let's say that at the end of the Civil War, the United States said, okay, now we're going to go right back to $1 worth of currency is equal to $1 worth of gold. That would mean that in reality, you would it would take $10 for $1. You get what I'm saying? So let's say that at the beginning of the Civil War, you borrowed $100, and at the end of the Civil War, you had to pay it back, but they went back to the gold standard. You'd have to pay back $1,000. Okay, so that's a problem. All right, and who's it going to be a problem for? Well, it's going to be a big problem for farmers, right? Because the way farming works is you at the beginning of the growing season, you borrow money, and then you buy seed and whatever equipment you need, and you support yourself through the growing season. And in the harvest time, you harvest your crops, you take them down to the railhead, and you sell them. And when you sell the crops, you get the money that you sold it for, you pay back the loan from the beginning of the year, and then whatever's left over is your profit. Okay. So if you borrowed $100 at the beginning of the year, and all of a sudden at the end of the year you owed $1,000, that's a big problem, isn't it? Right. So then we think about, well, the money issue then is going to be, should we stay on what they call the greenbacks, or in your book it's called soft money, or should we go back to the gold standard? And we'll talk more about that in a second. All right. Okay, the next one, the tariff, is a big issue. It's always been a big issue in American politics. And the reason why is because America had two different economies, right? It had an industrial economy and it had an agrarian economy. Okay. This was one of the major causes of the Civil War, because the North wanted to raise tariffs. Tariffs are a tax on imports, right? So in the commercial interests, the industrial interests wanted to raise tariffs because that made their products more competitive. You can look at the beginning, say at the beginning of the National Republic, at the time the Constitution went into effect, the situation was that you could actually buy better quality goods from England than American, because the English were better at industrialization. They had already industrialized to a certain extent, and Americans hadn't. So American manufacturers couldn't compete with the British. So what they wanted to do was they wanted to raise the tariff so that the British goods would cost more, and that would put them in competition with Americans, who would give a product that costs less. Maybe wasn't as good, but it costs a lot less. So tariffs are going to be good for industry because it protects them. It gives them an advantage over foreign competition. All right. And that is something that Americans enact, and it really works for the United States. The United States does become a great industrial power because of that, right? It surpasses Britain and every other power by the beginning of the 20th century. Okay. But it's going to have a harmful effect on the South, because the South, its major source of income is export agriculture. And that means that the countries that are importing America's exports are going to respond to the Americans raising tariffs by raising their own tariffs. And that means that when the American cotton growers sell their goods in Britain, they're not going to get as much money for it as they otherwise would, right? So the tariffs are going to be harmful to the American plantation owners because they don't get as much money. And in going even further than that, that because they are in export agriculture, they don't manufacture things. And that means that anything that's manufactured that they need, they have to import. And when those things that they import, they're having to pay more for, because they have to pay these tariffs. So it's a double whammy for the South. Okay, it's good for the North, but it's a double whammy for the South. Okay, and so the question is going to be, it's a perennial question, really. Should we have high tariffs and protect American industry, or should we have low tariffs and protect American agriculture. The main thing is to understand the tariffs essentially are supposed to be good for industry, and they're not good for agriculture. And in the beginning, the tariffs that Americans raised before the Civil War actually did protect American industry. So it was actually a win at that point.